Um, I do want to thank you all for coming to this event today. It's really exciting. I want to thank Nitsan Harel, who has just done a yeoman's job of putting together the back end of this event. I want to thank Debbie Paperman on our executive board, who's just done an outstanding job with social media. And I want to thank Victoria Solkovitz for finding us Dr. Waxman and for doing so much of the nitty-gritty computer work to make this work. Having done that, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria, who is our host for the evening, and Dr. Waxman. I again want to thank you very much on behalf of DFI LA for being here.
Hi, everybody. So I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Professor Dov Waxman. Dov Waxman is a professor and the chair of Israel Studies at UCLA, where he directs the Nazarian Center. He officially joined the UCLA faculty in January 2020. As an award-winning teacher, Professor Waxman was previously a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies at Northeastern University. He also co-directed the university's Middle East Center. He has also been a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Oxford. So checking off all those Israeli universities. Professor Waxman received his PhD and MA from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and his BA from Oxford. The professor's research focuses mainly over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli politics and foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish politics, and anti-Semitism. So for our subject today on the U.S.-Israel relationship post the 2020 elections, I think we are in very good hands. So with that being said, he recently just published his most recent publication is a book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which everybody needs to know. Highly recommend it for those of you looking to learn more. But with that, we are so excited to have him here. So I would love to turn it over to the professor. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Victoria. I want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and nice to see what UCLA has produced as a graduate of UCLA. So thank you for that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to meet with you all. Hopefully at some point in the future, hopefully not too far into the future, we'll be able to meet in person. As Victoria mentioned, I only moved to LA in January and just started work in January. So most of the time I've been here now has been during COVID and inside my house. So I really haven't had a chance to meet many people or get to know Los Angeles. So I hope, sometime in the future we'll be able to meet in person. And I think this new educational initiative that you're doing is really important. And so I'm honored to be the first speaker. I'm sure you'll have many great speakers in the future. So as you know, I'm going to be talking about US-Israel relations. I thought I would begin, first of all, by discussing US-Israel relations under a Biden administration, what I think will be the issues that are likely to arise. And then I want to move on and look more broadly, more into the long term, about the future of US-Israel relations and the future of US support for Israel. I don't want to just focus on the next 4 years, but rather, the years after that as well. So let me begin then, first of all, with how I think US-Israel relations are likely to fare under a Biden administration. To begin with, I think it's no great secret that Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, wanted President Trump to win this election. I think that's pretty obvious. Similarly, surveys show that most Israeli Jews also wanted President Trump to win the election. He is very popular in Israel, perhaps more popular than any of his predecessors has been. He has a square, in fact, in Israel named after him, and an Israeli settlement on the Golan Heights. So clearly there was this belief, widespread belief among Israelis before the election that Trump was their man. But I think despite that belief, I think that President-elect Biden will be a strong friend and supporter for Israel in the White House for the next 4 years, and in some respects, a better president for Israel than President Trump has been, in part because Biden will be much more predictable than President Trump has been. And predictability is something that is a value in any kind of relationship. Since his early days in the US Senate, Joe Biden has always been a strong supporter of Israel. And so there's really no reason, I think, to expect his administration not to support Israel. That said, despite the president's strong support for Israel and strong feelings for Israel, personal feelings for Israel, I think it's likely that US-Israeli relations in general will not be as close or certainly not as harmonious as they've been for the past 4 years. I think there's going to be serious disagreements between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government about Iran in particular and about Israeli settlement building. And I say the Netanyahu government because obviously Israeli governments can change. Netanyahu's hold on power is not nearly as strong as it once was. As I'm sure you all know, his trial for corruption is currently suspended, but that's going to get restart in February. And there could well be Israeli elections in the spring, which could bring a different government to power. But let's assume for the moment that Netanyahu remains in power. I think if that is the case, then at least on a personal level, President-elect Biden will get along better with Obama than with Bibi than Obama did. Clearly, that was a very fractious, fraught relationship. But unlike Obama's relationship with Netanyahu, when it comes to Biden and Netanyahu, they have a long history. They've known each other for decades, and there's no personal animosity between them in the way that I think there really was between Bibi and Obama. I also think, unlike Obama, Biden is going to be very careful to avoid having any kind of public clash with Netanyahu. He wants to keep disagreements, as much as possible, private. So he's only going to risk really taking on Netanyahu and risking a major crisis in US-Israel relations if there is a dispute that is really of great importance to the United States. But there is an issue that is of great importance to the United States, which I think could well provoke a major dispute with Israel. And that is, of course, the issue of Iran, which, needless to say, has been dominating the news just in recent days. I think Iran will be by far the biggest challenge for US-Israeli relations over the next 4 years. And we're already seeing this emerge even before President-elect Biden has come into office. Biden has committed to re-entering the Iran deal that was signed by the Obama administration in 2015, although he has also said that he wants to revise the deal. In particular, I think the plan is to extend its so-called sunset clauses, the timeline for when the deal will expire. But the Iran nuclear deal, or as the JCPOA, as it's more formally known, is seen widely in Israel in a very negative light, most particularly by Netanyahu, who was really the most outspoken international leader opposing the Iran nuclear deal, and as we all know and can remember, went to Congress in 2015 against to directly challenge the Obama administration over this nuclear agreement. So returning to a revised or some kind of revised nuclear agreement is likely to be viewed by Netanyahu and by many in Israel, it should be said, negatively. Similarly, the strategy of maximum pressure that has been pursued by President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo with regards to Iran, basically the attempt to ratchet up the economic pressure, the economic pain that Iranians feel in order to try to force Iran into a new agreement. That approach has been popular in Israel, but that is not an approach that the Biden administration is likely to pursue. So I think when it comes to the strategy toward Iran and when it comes to the nuclear agreement with Iran, there's bound to be a major dispute. That said, I think there are two important questions that I think we should keep an eye on in seeing how this dispute shapes up and really seeing whether it will escalate into a crisis in US-Israel relations. First, when it comes to the Iran deal itself, will the Biden administration, in trying to revise this deal, will they expand the terms of the deal to include the issue of Iran's ballistic missile development? That for Israel is a major issue, partly because nuclear weapons are delivered on ballistic missiles, so it's a delivery system for ballistic missiles, but also because Iran's ballistic missile program and its precision guided missiles really pose a very serious threat to Israel, particularly if Iran continues to supply those precision guided missiles to proxies like Hezbollah, which is believed to have already around 100,000 missiles in its arsenal. So that is really a kind of existential threat for Israel. And if the Iran deal, or if negotiations with Iran don't address its ballistic missile program, then I think that's something that Israel is going to be very unhappy about and will lead Israel probably to oppose any revised nuclear agreement with Iran. The other issue that's going to come up is whether the Biden administration will try to link the nuclear issue, Iran's nuclear program, with its other regional activities, in particular its effort to expand its power across the Middle East by supporting terrorist groups and proxy forces like Hezbollah or like the Houthis in Yemen or Shia militia in Iraq. Is that going to be an issue that will also, that the Biden administration will address, or will they focus, as the Obama administration did, more narrowly on just trying to get Iran's buy-in for a revised nuclear agreement? We don't know at this point, or at least I don't know, what the Biden administration is going to do. They've been pretty vague in their public statements on this, but I think those are the two issues on which Israel has very strong views that any agreement with Iran needs to address its wider regional activities as well as its ballistic missile program. And I think those are going to be major challenges. And I foresee a conflict, a dispute between the Biden administration and the Israeli government over Iran as probably being the biggest issue that's going to upset this relationship. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think is another potential source of disagreement between the Biden administration and at least the current Israeli government, I don't expect Biden to prioritize the issue in the way that Obama did when he first came into office. You'll remember when Obama came into office on day one, he appointed George Mitchell to try to get a peace process going, and he really said that this was something that he wanted to resolve this conflict, as did President Trump, of course. Biden, by contrast, I think is unlikely to push for a resolution of the conflict because he knows all too well that the prospects for such a resolution are slim to non-existent. Instead, I expect the Biden administration to really try to maintain the possibility of a future two-state solution to the conflict, something that Biden has long supported. So they're really not, I don't think, going to go for a peace agreement so much as at least try to ensure that the situation on the ground keeps open the possibility of a peace agreement sometime down the line. What does this mean? Well, first and foremost, it means that the Biden administration will not allow Israel to formally annex large parts of the West Bank, 30% of the West Bank, for example, which I think Trump would have certainly done in his second term. So on the issue of Israel's annexation or formal annexation of the West Bank, I think there's going to be a big difference. But the question for me is whether the Biden administration will be willing to try or able to try to stop what analysts describe as Israel's de facto annexation of territory in the West Bank. Not its formal annexation, but rather the expansion of Israeli settlements deeper into the West Bank and other kind of legal measures and legal steps that the Israeli governments have been taking, which essentially make these parts of the West Bank Israeli territory. I doubt the Biden administration will do much to stop this process. To be sure, the Biden himself opposes Israeli settlement building. He was livid, for example, when he was visiting Israel as vice president, and there was a set announcement about settlement construction in East Jerusalem. But I don't think Biden himself will do much to stop settlement expansion. In particular, he's not going to threaten to cut or condition US aid to Israel in order to pressure it to freeze its settlement activity, something that some members of the Democratic Party would like him to do, but something that Biden has been very clear, unequivocal about during the Democratic primaries, saying that leveraging US aid to Israel would be what he calls a gigantic mistake. So I don't think that's likely to happen. In more broad terms, I think we'll see a kind of return to a more even-handed approach to the conflict. An approach that was typical not only of the Obama administration, but also of other US administrations, both Democratic and Republican. Really, the Trump administration's approach has been the departure from decades of US policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when it comes to kind of reversing some of the steps, some of the decisions taken by the Trump administration with regard to the conflict, I think the Biden administration is going to be kind of selective on what it's going to reverse. It's not going to reverse the recognition of Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. It's not going to move the US embassy back to Tel Aviv, as some might hope it would do. But I think it will reopen the US consulate in East Jerusalem and also reopen the Palestinian mission, which is effectively an embassy in Washington, which was closed 2 years ago. So in those respects, the Biden administration will at least restore US diplomatic channels with the Palestinians and US relations with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which had basically completely been severed during the Trump administration. Similarly, I think the Biden administration will try to restore at least some US economic aid to the Palestinian Authority, economic aid, which was completely cut by the Trump administration. For the Palestinian leadership, all of these steps will be welcome. They won't go as far enough as the Palestinians are concerned, but they will be welcome. And it should also, I will also point out that many of these steps will also be welcomed by the Israeli security establishment. For example, the US decision, the Trump administration's decision to cut US aid to the Palestinian Authority was not something that the Israeli security establishment wanted. They worry about the stability of the Palestinian Authority. They want the Palestinian Authority to continue its security cooperation with Israel. And so, a stronger Palestinian Authority, a more legitimate Palestinian Authority even, is actually in Israel's interest, and I think Israel would welcome that. So I think in broad terms, US support for Israel will undoubtedly continue over the next 4 years, but I think there's going to be some major disputes that are likely to arise, particularly when it comes to Iran. When it comes to the long term, however, beyond the next 4 years, I think that US support for Israel is likely to become increasingly controversial within and less guaranteed. And I want to explain why I think this. I don't want to suggest that I think US support for Israel is going to end anytime soon, but I do think it's likely to become a lot more contentious domestically and less certain. Why? Well, in order to understand why American support for Israel isn't such a sure thing in the future, I think it's first useful to understand the reasons why the United States supports Israel so strongly in the first place. And it's also important to recognize that this hasn't always been the case. People may believe that the United States has always been Israel's strongest ally, closest ally. That's not, in fact, true. US-Israel relations weren't always so close. For the first 2 decades of Israel's existence, Washington actually kept Jerusalem at arm's length. In fact, when Israel, along with Britain and France, invaded Egypt in 1956 in the Suez War, the United States effectively sided with Egypt and forced Israel to withdraw its troops from the Sinai. Although US-Israel relations started to warm slightly during the Kennedy administration, it wasn't really until the Johnson and Nixon administrations in the late 1960s and early 1970s that US support for Israel really intensified. And the reason for this was the Cold War. Basically, Israel's decisive victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 convinced American policymakers that Israel could be a useful tool for containing Soviet influence in the Middle East, influence which was significant among Arab states at that time. So Israel came to be regarded by US policymakers as a strategic asset rather than as a potential liability. And as that shift in perception took place, so US policymakers provided Israel with more and more diplomatic, economic, and military support. Just to give you a couple of indications of this support, since 1976, Israel has generally been the largest annual recipient of US foreign assistance, the only exceptions occasionally being Iraq and Afghanistan after 2004. In fact, Israel has received more US foreign aid in total than any other country. In the past, this included a significant amount of economic assistance, but now almost all US bilateral aid to Israel is in the form of military aid. So as you probably know, the US gives Israel $3.8 billion annually, and that amounts to roughly 15 to 20% of Israel's defense budget. That figure is slated to continue through to 2028, and according to the terms of the so-called Memorandum of Understanding that the Obama administration signed with Netanyahu's government in 2016, despite the bad relations between Obama and Netanyahu, that was actually the single largest pledge of military assistance in American history, which totaled $38 billion. So in addition to this huge amount of military aid that the United States has given Israel, the United States has also expended an enormous amount of political capital at the United Nations and in a wide range of other international organizations to shield Israel from criticism or censor. In the UN Security Council alone, since 1972, the United States has vetoed 44 resolutions that were critical of Israel, much more than any other country. And members of Congress have unanimously passed countless resolutions expressing their unequivocal support for Israel. No other country, no other US ally has consistently received this kind of support from the United States. Strategic considerations alone can't fully account for this extraordinary level of support. Now, to be sure, Israel is the United States' closest strategic partner in what I think is the world's most unstable region. And the United States does benefit in various ways from its special relationship with Israel in areas like intelligence, military training, military technology, and more recently, cyber warfare and cyber security. But US support for Israel isn't just about strategic benefits and a shared perception of regional threats, or at least not anymore. For a long time, at least since the 1980s, it's also been about American domestic politics. But simply, supporting Israel is good politics. Why? Well, first and foremost, it's good politics because American public opinion is very sympathetic to Israel. The American public likes and supports Israel for a whole variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go into. But just to point to a few, there's a popular belief in their shared values, the values that Israel shares with the United States, a popular image of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, and a view of Israel as an embattled, vulnerable outpost of the West, surrounded by enemies bent on its destruction. I think that view is a bit outdated, but it's still one that's widely held. A second major factor that makes supporting Israel good politics in the United States is the fact that the two of the most politically engaged groups in the United States, Jews and evangelical Christians, are both overwhelmingly pro-Israel, and they're important constituencies in the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively. Though they support Israel for very different reasons, American Jews and evangelical Christians are the most vocal and active domestic constituencies in favor of strong US support for Israel. And their combined political influence is the reason why Israel has become such a salient issue in American domestic politics. More so than any other foreign country, Israel is regularly mentioned in presidential elections and is a standard issue in party platforms. Only recently China, I think, surpassing that for obvious reasons. American presidents routinely discuss issues relating to Israel in their speeches, and members of Congress routinely refer to Israel in their campaigns and often demonstrate their support for Israel in legislative actions and public statements. And I think part of the reason, and this is part of the reason why. There's a third factor, I think, that makes for why supporting Israel is good politics, and that is the pro-Israel lobby, in particular groups like AIPAC. While the pro-Israel lobby has never been as all-powerful as its critics contend, it's certainly been able to wield political influence in Washington since the 1980s, largely, I think, because of its perceived ability, and I emphasize perceived ability to reward politicians who support its agenda and punish those who are deemed to be anti-Israel. If you add broad public support, evangelicals, Jews, and a powerful pro-Israel lobby together, you get strong, consistent, bipartisan US support for Israel. But these factors are changing, and it's important to understand that. How? First, American public opinion towards Israel is changing. Second, American Jews no longer support Israel unconditionally and uncritically. And third, the pro-Israel lobby is now divided and becoming less powerful. I'm going to talk about each of these factors in turn. First, surveys show that Americans in general still support Israel, but there is a generational divide in support for Israel, with younger Americans, those born after 1980, more likely to be less supportive of Israel and more supportive of the Palestinians than older Americans. Different generations of Americans seem to have different views towards Israel. And I think this is partly because they came of age politically during different periods in Israel's history. So Americans who came of age politically during the 1960s remember the 1967 war, remember the fear for Israel's existence that preceded the war and the euphoria that followed Israel's triumph in the Six-Day War, or remember how vulnerable Israel was in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Their memories of Israel, which shapes their perceptions of Israel, are very different than the memories of younger Americans who came of age during the Second Intifada, for example, or during Israel's more recent wars with Hamas. Since millennials, who tend to be more critical of Israel according to surveys, are emerging as the largest voting bloc in the United States, I think this may well have an effect on US support for Israel in the future. People's views that are formed in late adolescence and early adulthood don't tend to change dramatically over time. There's a period when people formulate their political views and then they tend to remain consistent for the rest of their lifetimes. Younger Americans are also more liberal than older generations of Americans, and as you probably know, they're more likely to vote for Democrats. So this contributes to a growing partisan divide in support for Israel. Now, I want to be clear, Israel still enjoys majority support among supporters of both parties, but surveys have indicated a widening partisan divide. Until the late 1990s, support for Israel was basically similar among Democrats and Republicans, among Democrat and Republican voters. That begins to change after 9/11, with a significant increase in Republican support for Israel during George W. Bush's presidency. Democrat support for Israel didn't decline during this period. It remained pretty steady, in fact, throughout the 2000s, despite the Second Intifada, Second Lebanon War, Operation Cast Lead, it was pretty consistent. But more recently, and really since around 2015, support for Israel among Democrats, particularly liberal Democrats, has been declining. A recent Pew poll just carried out earlier this year, for example, found that 55% of Democrats viewed Israel favorably, compared with 74% of Republicans, so nearly a 20-point gap. And a majority of Republicans, 60%, also had a favorable view of the Israeli government. Only 26% of Democrats had a favorable view of the Israeli government in that survey. Polling has also shown that Democrats are much less likely to sympathize with Israel, sympathize more with Israel in its conflict with the Palestinians. Now, I don't need to tell you this. This doesn't mean that Democrats don't support Israel, as Republicans, especially President Trump, like to claim. One survey from 2019 of likely Democratic primary and caucus voters found that Democratic voters' views of Israel and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are nuanced. Surprise, surprise. They support Israel despite their personal dislike of Netanyahu. An overwhelming majority of Democratic primary voters in that survey, 81%, said that someone can be critical of Israeli government policies and still be pro-Israel. And this is the key distinction that Democrats increasingly make. Many Democratic supporters of Israel find it difficult to condone Israeli government policies. For example, they oppose Israeli settlement construction because they believe it makes a two-state solution less viable. But they still support Israel. They make a distinction then between their opposition to Israeli government policies and their support for the state of Israel. But when it comes to Israeli policies, Republican support for Israeli policies has become basically unconditional, as we've seen over the last few years, whereas Democrats have become more critical of those policies and are increasingly opposing unconditional US support for Israeli government policies. So I think if this partisan divide over Israel continues to widen, and really with the political polarization that's happening in the United States, I think this is likely to continue, this partisan divide. The political consensus, the domestic political consensus in favor of strong US support for Israel will erode in the years to come. And consequently, support for Israel will become more controversial politically and more contested. There's already a growing debate, as you're all no doubt aware, between moderates and progressives in the Democratic Party over the issue of, for instance, placing conditions on US military aid to Israel, a question that used to be politically taboo. 3 presidential candidates, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg, all publicly expressed a willingness to either cut, condition, or somehow restrict US aid to Israel. The fact that they did so, I think, is unprecedented for a presidential candidate and is indicative of the kind of shift that is taking place within the Democratic Party in its attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nowadays, expressing support for Palestinian rights or pushing for a shift on US policy is no longer the kind of political risk it once was for a Democrat. That said, I don't think that the Democratic Party will become like the British Labour Party was under Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think the Democratic Party will shift to the far left in its positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For one thing, because that could risk alienating many Jewish American voters and donors who are an important constituency for the Democratic Party. Instead, I think the Democratic Party will actually express the views of most American Jews who are still fundamentally supportive of Israel, but have also become more critical of its government's policies, particularly regarding the Palestinians. In fact, in many ways, the shifting attitudes of Democrats towards Israel bears some significant similarities with the shifting attitudes of American Jews towards Israel, from what I would call unconditional support to a more critical but still supportive stance. And I wrote a lot about this shift in my book, Trouble in the Tribe. The fact that the Democratic Party is coming in some respects to resemble the American Jewish community when it comes to Israel isn't surprising if you think about the influence that J Street, the liberal Jewish lobby group, has within the Democratic Party today. It is a major contributor to Democratic candidates, its PAC. In the 2020 election, it donated a total of $9 million to Democratic candidates, including over $2 million to President-elect Biden. And I think J Street's rise, or its growth since 2008, is really the most politically significant consequence so far of a sea change in attitudes that has taken place within the American Jewish community regarding Israel over the past few decades. This isn't a change that started in 2008 when J Street was formed, rather it's a change that actually dates back to the early 1980s, to Israel's war in Lebanon, and then the First Intifada. But J Street's basic message that, in the words of its founder, Jeremy Ben-Ami, you don't have to be non-critical, you don't have to adopt the party line, it's not Israel right or wrong, that message now resonates widely within the American Jewish community today. Partly, J Street has benefited from the kind of critical space that has opened up within the American Jewish community concerning Israel, but it's also helped enlarge this space, helping legitimize criticism of Israeli policies within the mainstream of the American Jewish community. Surveys show that for most American Jews today, there is now a difference between supporting Israel and supporting its government's policies, especially when those policies are right-wing. And so just as Democratic voters make that distinction between supporting Israel and supporting its government's policies, so too do American Jews. Although American Jews continue to be committed to Israel, or at least most of them continue to be committed to Israel, the strength of this commitment, and in particular its ability to mobilize political activism, is much less certain today than it once was, especially when it comes to a younger generation of American Jews. Now, there's a big scholarly debate, which I won't go into, over whether younger American Jews are less attached to Israel and whether this signals a generational decline in attachment to Israel, with subsequent generations becoming less and less attached to Israel or more emotionally distant from it. We'll have to see how this plays out over time, but I think it's already clear that attachment, emotional attachment to Israel, caring about Israel, worrying about its security, caring about its welfare, no longer translates automatically into support for Israeli government policies in the way that it once did. The weakening of support for Israel among liberal, largely secular American Jews has coincided with the strengthening of support for Israel among conservative, mostly white evangelical Christians. Indeed, Christian evangelicals have in many ways supplanted American Jews as Israel's most loyal supporters in the United States today. In recent years, evangelicals have also come to vastly outnumber American Jews in the pro-Israel lobby. Christians United for Israel, an evangelical group that was founded in 2006 by Reverend John Hagee, a pastor of a megachurch in Southeast Texas, now claims to have a staggering 8 million members. That's about the size of the entire US Jewish population. During the past 4 years, CUFI, Christians United for Israel, became a really influential player in Washington, in some respects rivaling AIPAC, and Christians United for Israel had a major influence, for instance, on the Trump administration's decision to relocate the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So conservative evangelical Christians are now driving, or increasingly driving, Republican policy towards Israel, while secular progressive activists and voters are gaining growing influence in the Democratic Party. And I think these two trends mean that US policy toward Israel is likely to become increasingly contentious in the future. As this is happening, the pro-Israel lobby is not nearly as united as it once was. In fact, it's now deeply divided between J Street on the left, AIPAC in the center, and groups like the Zionist Organization of America and CUFI, Christians United for Israel, on the right. As a result of the political disagreements within the pro-Israel lobby, they no longer act in unison, these groups, and in fact, they frequently oppose each other. We really can speak of different pro-Israel lobbies rather than a single lobby. The pro-Israel lobby no longer speaks to the US government with a single voice, as it did in earlier eras when you had AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents. And this cacophony of voices coming from pro-Israel groups reduces their political influence, because in the past, their influence was partly based on the belief that pro-Israel groups, particularly AIPAC, spoke for the American Jewish community as a whole. Today, no organization can credibly claim to represent the overwhelming majority of American Jews. And consequently, American policymakers and legislatures are less inclined to listen to them, let alone follow their advice. To quote Joe Biden, who was then the Democratic vice presidential nominee in the run-up to 2008 election, this is him speaking, AIPAC doesn't speak for the entire Jewish community or for the state of Israel. No one in AIPAC or any other organization can question my support of Israel. I think a divided pro-Israel lobby also gives policymakers more options. They can get information, analysis, and support, political support, from groups that already fit their politics or their political agenda. And they can turn to different groups depending on the circumstances and their particular political needs at any given moment. So they can kind of pick and choose which groups they want to work with or which groups they want to gain endorsements from. The power of the pro-Israel lobby is also diminishing because pro-Israel groups are less able to defeat politicians they are viewed as strongly critical of Israel. In the past year alone, pro-Israel groups failed to defeat progressive congressional candidates in Democratic primary races in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. Representative Rashida Tlaib, a supporter of BDS, easily won her primary in Michigan. In Minnesota, Representative Ilhan Omar easily defeated her challenger despite the large amount of financial support that he received from pro-Israel groups, from pro-Israel political action committees. And perhaps most surprisingly, in the primary for New York's 16th congressional district, challenger Jamal Bowman, a progressive, easily defeated Eliot Engel, a 16-term Jewish congressman and the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who had been a key ally of AIPAC and was heavily backed by pro-Israel PACs. In fact, Engel received more pro-Israel funding for his primary race than any other member of Congress. The cumulative effect of these primaries, I think, is to puncture the pro-Israel lobby's aura of invincibility, which is a key ingredient in its power. In other words, the perception that it is powerful. And I don't think these election results are an aberration. In many ways, they're the result of innovations in the way that election campaigns are now run that have helped level the playing field. Because nowadays, politicians can raise large sums of money from many small dollar donors. So that means they're less reliant on PACs. And they can also use social media such as Twitter and Facebook to get their messages across to potential voters rather than having to pay for expensive television commercials. So that reduces the financial advantage of well-funded candidates. All of this means that it makes it harder for pro-Israel PACs, political action committees, to defeat candidates deemed as anti-Israel. And if they can't defeat these candidates, these politicians, and re-elect pro-Israel ones like Eliot Engel, their political influence will decline. So when you take these developments, these trends as I've outlined them together, demographic trends, social trends, political trends, I think the future of the long-term future of America's special relationship with Israel is at risk. The pillars on which this relationship has been based are being challenged. And this is occurring as Israel is itself changing in ways that I think could fuel future disputes with the United States on issues ranging from the state of democracy in Israel to policy towards the Palestinians. So I don't want to suggest that the US government in the future won't support Israel. I think the United States will continue to support Israel if it's in America's interest to do so. But the level of support may decline and become less exceptional and more like US support for other allies. So the kind of specialness, if you like, of this special relationship could be challenged. The United States will continue to support Israel as long as American policymakers think it's strategically beneficial to the United States to support Israel, which they do. But even this belief that it's strategically beneficial for the United States to support Israel is less certain in the long run because US strategic interests are changing. The United States today is much less reliant on Middle East oil, for example, and it needs increasingly to shift its attention to its growing competition with China and to a lesser extent with Russia. So the US's preoccupation and focus on the Middle East, an area in which Israel has been a key strategic ally, is shifting. Already, Israeli officials are worried about the US's desire to withdraw its troops from the Middle East and so-called pivot its attention towards Asia. And this strategic pivot or this shift isn't something that's just happened under the Trump administration. In fact, it began under the Obama administration and may well continue under a Biden administration. So the fear among within the Israeli security establishment, as well as I should say, among Saudis and others in the region, is that the US is slowly or gradually trying to disengage from the region, or at least lower its involvement in the region. And if that's true, if that continues, then US support for Israel in the long term is not guaranteed. I will end on that depressing note and be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, we have quite a few questions for you already. And as we continue, feel free, everyone, to either take yourself off mute if you want to ask yourself, or send it in the chat to everyone, or you can send it to me privately, whatever floats your boat. With that being said, Professor, so our first question is that given your ties to the UK, what impact do you think the Biden administration's relationship with Boris Johnson will have for effectiveness in Middle East policy, if it's significant at all? And that if Keir Starmer becomes the next prime minister, do we think that will be better for this relationship or no change?
I thought there was going to be a question about Jeremy Corbyn. As soon as somebody hears my British accent, that's normally the first question that people ask. So that was a surprise. I was preparing to talk about Corbyn. Look, I don't think the British, honestly, despite their own self-perception as a major world power, really, I think that's a kind of myth that the British continue to feed on. So when it comes to US Middle East policy, I don't really think it makes much difference whether Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer is in power, because the British are not any longer a major player in the region. The EU, now the British are obviously no longer in the EU, so they've reduced their influence. I won't go on to Brexit, but they've reduced their influence even further. But I do think there's going to be a closer alignment between the US position and the EU's position when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other Middle East issues like Iran. I mean, one of the things that's happened over the last 4 years has been a really serious erosion of the US relationship with its major European allies, with the exception of the British, because of Boris Johnson. But when it comes to the EU, which is a player in the Middle East, and it does matter with regards to both Iran and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think there's going to be not exactly the state. I don't think they're going to be on the same page of Biden administration and the EU. I don't think I think the European attitudes toward Israel and toward the conflict are different, fundamentally different than they are in the United States. Partly because, as I said, in the United States you have a basically supportive public opinion, and that's not necessarily the case in European countries, with maybe the notable exception of Germany. So I think there will still be differences, but yes, there will at least be maybe more reading from the same script, and at least maybe playing kind of good cop, bad cop in the way that they did during the Obama administration, where they worked together to try to pressure Iran and also, seek some kind of progress on the Palestinian issue. But I don't think it's going to make a huge difference when it comes to the British government. But I think more to the point when it comes to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party is, this view which that the Labour Party and what happened under Jeremy Corbyn with regards to anti-Semitism and its policies toward Israel was somehow a prelude to what would happen among the Democratic Party here. The Labour Party was presented by Republicans in the United States as, look, this is where the Democrats will end up. This is what's going to happen to the Democrats. And it allowed Republicans to claim that the Democrats were anti-Semitic because Labour Party was, and they were kind of birds of a feather, if you like. What we've seen under Keir Starmer already is a strong repudiation of the kind of anti-Semitism that emerged and escalated in the Labour Party under Corbyn. And already the British Jewish community has, turned the page, if you like, in its relationship with the Labour Party. And I think that's actually good for the Democratic Party here as well, because it makes it clear that you can be a liberal or you can be a progressive. It doesn't mean that you have to hate Israel.
Great, awesome. So also last week we heard rumors that Netanyahu and maybe some other top brass had traveled to Saudi Arabia for a under-the-table meeting. If you had to guess, what are some of the action items that were maybe discussed there? What would you say that they are? And what do you also think of the report that the Crown Prince is holding off establishing relations until Biden is actually in office?
Yeah, well, obviously I wasn't privy to what happened in that meeting. A meeting, I should point out, that the Saudis still officially deny even took place. So let's not get too carried away on the prospects for Saudi normalization with Israel anytime soon, as they don't even admit to a meeting that everybody knows has happened. But I think, what came up, well, before this last weekend, we thought it was about normalization, right? But it's probably actually more likely to have been about maybe some mention of what took place, the assassination of Iran's chief nuclear scientist. And really, I think they're really, where Israel, I mean, the issue of normalization is very important. But I don't think that's going to happen. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen while the king is alive. As long as the king is alive, and he may not be for much longer. He's elderly, supposedly in poor health. He is and has long been a strong supporter of the Saudis, of the Palestinians, even though his son would like, I think, to normalize with Israel and couldn't care less about the Palestinians. As long as King Saud is still alive, I don't expect that the Saudis will kind of cross the Rubicon, so to speak, and publicly normalize their relationship with Israel, even to get in the good graces of the Biden administration. I think really, if anything, what's really the substance of that relationship is really strategizing how to counter Iran, and now how to prevent the Biden administration from re-entering a nuclear agreement with Iran like the one that the Obama administration signed in 2015. Both the Saudis and the Israeli government and the Emiratis are very worried about a new nuclear agreement with Iran. And, they're going to be trying to coordinate their campaigns to not necessarily to prevent such an agreement, but to shape it, to ensure that it at least addresses their concerns that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk.
Definitely. And, with that being said, we know that the Biden administration announced their pick for Secretary of State last week as well. So what was your reaction to the nomination of Blinken as Secretary of State? Do you think there's anything noteworthy in his background pertaining specifically to the U.S.-Israel relationship, or what do you think we can expect from him as Secretary?
I wasn't surprised. I think everybody knew that he was likely to get that appointment. I mean, he's been, close to Biden for a long time, and he was in charge of the transition on foreign policy issues. He is Jewish, so you may think, well, that means he's going to be, it's supportive of Israel. But as I pointed out, many Jews are supportive of Israel and critical of its government's policies. So you can't infer based upon, his religious ethnic background, what his feelings will be about Israeli settlement building, for example. I think what we're really going to see in the across the board really is a return to an attempt to return to normalcy, an attempt to return to patterns of American foreign policy that have been consistent across Republican and Democratic administrations. Not a radical change from the past, a change from the Trump administration. That was a radical change. But I think in many ways it's going to be a kind of an attempt to restore some bipartisan approach where the US will reaffirm its support for a two-state solution, reaffirm its view that settlement building is illegal or at least unhelpful, oppose settlement building publicly, but probably not doing anything really about it. And as I said, and on other issues, trying to bring up again human rights concerns in US approach to the Middle East. So I think in many ways, it's kind of going to look like the Obama administration, and not just the Obama administration, even the George W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration policies have been. So I don't think there's going to be any big disruptions or changes, but of course, a lot depends upon events in the region. I mean, we've just seen this weekend, the Biden administration, I think their inclination and Blinken's administration will be kind of softly and not try to rock the boat too much. And, they've got enough on their plate anyway, and they've got other issues they want to deal with. But the Middle East has a way of, surprising administrations and throwing curveballs, and things can happen. And so if that happens, then I think Blinken will be the face of this dispute, because it's not going to be Biden doing it. It will be Blinken who will be out there making the case for the Iran nuclear deal part 2, or for some sort of restored peace process with the Palestinians. And so despite the fact that he is supportive of Israel, he is Jewish, he's still likely to end up being called anti-Semitic by some on the other political parties, some members of the other political party, I think, because that's the goal, is to kind of depict the Democrats as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic.
Great. Okay, so our next question is, do you anticipate any challenges with the Biden administration resuming aid to the Palestinian Authority with the Taylor Force Act being law now?
Yeah, well, that is, yes. I mean, unless, as it currently stands, it will be extremely difficult, I think. Probably people on this call have a better idea than I do of how difficult it will be, but it will be very difficult to restore US aid to the Palestinian Authority, which you need congressional approval for, if the Palestinian Authority doesn't change its payments to security prisoners, terrorists, people who are serving time in Israeli prisons for carrying out terrorist actions and murders of Israelis. The Palestinian Authority has recently floated this idea that they are going to reform this system. They know that really the only way they're going to open the spigot and get restored US aid is through ending its so-called pay-to-slay policy, or these payments that go to Palestinian prisoners based upon the length of their time in prison. The real challenge is going to be whether the Palestinian Authority, which is already deeply unpopular among Palestinians, and even more so since COVID with the kind of collapse of the Palestinian Authority economy, whether it's going to be able to do that and retain, domestically. Now, it isn't a democracy, so of course Abbas has the ability to do that, but it's going to be a question of really, how they can get that by while ensuring stability among Palestinians and some kind of support. I think they probably will do it, but I think it's going to be messy and it's going to be kind of a drawn out process. It's not going to happen quickly. So that's probably one area where you're not going to see a kind of, on day 1 or even day 31, and a return to the policies of the past. That's going to be, I think, because it requires congressional approval, the Biden administration will be constrained in its ability to, restore US funding to the Palestinian Authority. What it can do, though, and what it, I think, will do, is restore funding to the UN Refugee and Works Agency, which provides aid to Palestinian refugees. It will probably do that. And I think it will also restore funding to Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem, Palestinian NGOs. So there's other ways in which the United States can can restore some funding, but not for the Palestinian Authority while that policy is still in place.
Great. Okay, so next we're going to have David Alpern unmute, and then I see that Meyer also has his hand up, so we'll go to him next. So David, if you want to unmute and ask, that would be great.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Terrific. Thank you. I will say thank you as well for this. Really appreciating you being our first guest. A lot of what you've talked about has been recent past, and you've also prognosticated about the first 100 days of the Biden administration. Can I ask you a couple of questions and ask you to maybe read your tea leaves about what's going to be happening deeper down in the future? And I'll give you 3 examples and you can expand however you wish. One is the tragedy in Syria. Do you see any tea leaves suggesting the Assad era may be anywhere closer to finally ending? And when the post-Assad era arrives, if it happens during the Biden administration, do you foresee the people there and the next government desiring a better relationship with Israel? So one is the future with Syria. Second one is Assad is probably going to leave the world stage pretty soon. We all know how old he is. I have a lot of respect for Mohammed Dahlan. The Arab League loves him as well. What do you foresee in your tea leaves as who might become the next PA president? How do you handicap that race? And the third race in the future is the next Israeli prime minister, and who do you think would work well with the Biden administration? Of course, everybody talks about Bennett, but there's also Lapid, Yalon, and Ashkenazi. And of course, the one that I'm most afraid of is Gidon Sar. So those three.
Oh, okay. Those are great questions, really tough. I mean, so the future of Israeli domestic politics, Syrian politics, and Palestinian politics. That's a tough one. You know, first of all, I guess I'm gonna, I don't want to evade the question, but I want to kind of humbly acknowledge the limits of our understanding and the ability and the difficulty of predicting, you know, precisely because you know, in all of those arenas, Syria, Palestine, it's always been, we've often got it wrong, right? Events have often happened that have not been predicted and have spiraled and escalated. And so it's very difficult to kind of see how, you know, period too far into the future because things have often been, the region has been so unpredictable so frequently. With regards to Syria, so that's my caveat. But with regards to Syria, you know, I unfortunately, I mean, I'm pleased you raised it because it's often a kind of forgotten about conflict. You know, the fact that so many people have been killed and are still dying in Syria is something that's just disappeared from our media, from the headlines and from our kind of political conversation. I think Syria is a kind of broken state, is really in many ways a failed state today. So I think the long term, I just can't see a way, although the war in Syria is closing, I don't think the Assad regime is going to be able to like completely restore its control over every part of the country. It's certainly not going to be able to rebuild its legitimacy. Well, it never had that to begin with. So I think it's going to be a long time, sadly, before there's going to be a government in place in Syria that's going to be willing or able to sit down with the Israelis and re-enter negotiations over, for example, the Golan Heights. And now that the Trump administration has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, it's also much harder for any future Israeli government to negotiate the future status of the Golan Heights. Let's not forget that Netanyahu himself offered to return the Golan Heights back in the day. This is in the late 1990s to Hafez al-Assad, the current president's father. That kind of an offer made by a Likud leader would just be inconceivable today, partly because of this application of sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So I think it's going to be a long, long time. And I think Syria, you know, the kind of chaos and instability and violence in Syria is going to be a security concern for Israel for a long time to come. And really the concern there is just trying to ensure that, you know, one of Israel's competitors like Iran or Turkey doesn't end up becoming the kind of dominant external power in Syria in the way that Syria became in Lebanon. In other words, Syria is going to basically look like Lebanon. And it's going to be, you know, and that's not good for Israel's security interests. On the Palestinian, it's really hard to kind of read the tea leaves of Palestinian politics because they are so opaque. I don't see any of the names that have been mentioned as possible successors to Abbas as having the ability to take over with any kind of popular support. So I actually think we're more likely to see a kind of triumvirate or a few leaders working together, or not together as the case may be, competing for power, rather than the kind of, you know, dominant leader that Arafat was and then Abbas became. The day in which kind of you had these dominant Palestinian leaders may be over. You know, I mean, there's nobody who, at least according to the opinion polls that I've seen, there's nobody who really has majority. Maybe Mustafa Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 10 life sentences in Israeli prisons. So other than him, there's the only person who has maybe majority support among Palestinians. All the others are supported by small numbers of Palestinians, and I think are not going to have the kind of legitimacy. The issue is as well when it comes to Palestinian politics, it's not just a question of who will take over from Abbas, but because the fundamental issue for the Palestinians, and I won't go into this at length, is that the Palestinian Authority itself is illegitimate today. Palestinian Authority was established as a kind of precursor to a Palestinian state, as a state in the making. And as the prospects for Palestinian statehood have increasingly disappeared, so the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of Palestinians has disappeared along with it. And so it doesn't, we can talk about this individual or that individual. They, some of them may be slightly more competent than others, but at the end of the day, the Palestinian Authority has a kind of Achilles heel, which is that it's been bound up with a peace process that is now dead. And so I think whoever takes over from the bus, as I say, I think it'd be more likely to be a few people working together, is unlikely to be able to have the kind of authority or legitimacy to make an agreement with Israel. Unfortunately, partly why I'm pessimistic, because I think Abbas is the last Palestinian leader for some time who has that ability, and he doesn't have it any longer, really, or at least he doesn't have the interest. On Israeli politics, that's somewhat less opaque, but no less Byzantine than the Palestinian politics. If you look at I think whoever succeeds Netanyahu's most likely, at least, going to come from the right. Gideon Saar is obviously a serious contender who has some support among the Likud grassroots, so he could do it, and he's not kind of been tainted with the corruption, etc., the stench of corruption of Netanyahu. Obviously, right now, Naftali Bennett is riding a surge of popularity because partly because of the incompetence of the government over COVID. But yeah, I think if I was going to predict, it would, it depends on really how much Netanyahu is able to manage the process of his succession. If he is still in control of the Likud as he is today, then it won't be Gideon Saar. It's more likely somebody like Yisrael Katz or somebody who will basically be an ally of Netanyahu and will probably try to get Netanyahu pardoned from whatever crimes he might be convicted of. If Netanyahu is convicted, loses his support, then I think, Gideon Saar would probably be the most likely candidate to succeed him. Either way, it's going to be another right-wing leader. It's not going to be, if some Americans like to imagine that if you get rid of Netanyahu, you're going to have some, Rabin-like center-left figure. Benny Gantz is not such a character, and I don't think there's anybody on the center-left who has the support, the stature, unfortunately, among Israelis to succeed, to really challenge a center-right leader. So it's going to be, some version. And that's why really it's a mistake to focus on Netanyahu as the issue, because the issue is not Netanyahu. I mean, he may be an issue in his willingness to brazenly work with the Republican Party in the United States to undermine US administrations. That is his issue. That is Netanyahu specific. But more broadly, the policies he stands for and the positions and the views he expresses are ones widely held by many Israelis, and that's just a fact.
Great. All right. Meyer, would you like to go too?
Thank you very much. The Palestinian issue, first of all, the PA shouldn't be there anymore, like you stated. Mordechai Kedar, who teaches at Bar-Ilan University, also teaches the Islamic history, religion, and speaks to languages. So he understands how they think. Now, in understanding the history and so forth, you mentioned failed states. The reason why the failed states was because they tried to make these states, such as the Ottoman Empire, they tried to make them like Europe. They're either you would have those who believe in religion. They have what do you call their tribal and other things, which is older than the states. So consequently, the thing is completely different. Now, Mordechai Kedar wrote what's called the 8-state solution, work in Emirates like Dubai and so forth. Now you have 8 of them. I don't know if you've ever read his stuff.
I have, and I've discussed actually this proposal with him, which I think is, I mean, I you know, I don't want to focus on him, but I don't think this idea of kind of having 8 different emirates of is at all viable.
But it solves the problem, and the basic reason why it solves the problem is because with their believing system, if you look very carefully, the religion itself states that Judaism and Christianity does not belong anymore. It's null and void. So when Israel was started in the 48, what, they're coming back? This is why they had the fights, and so forth and so forth. Now the PA wanted to get Jerusalem. Jordan controlled Jerusalem for over 7,000 days. Why didn't they ask them at that time? You see, the whole problem is, what they're asking for is they have a scarf that they wear. It says Jerusalem is ours on one side, and it shows the whole country, the whole state of Israel as theirs. You got to realize those common sense on how they think. The thinking process is completely different than what we understand. A 2-state solution will never work. If they really want to get something started, they could get rid of the PA and make these different places like you got Jenin, you got Jericho, you got Hebron, you got a whole variety. Gaza is already a state, whether anybody wanted it or not. What they were stating in this 8-state solution was they would surround the areas so that they don't become a Hamastan like the Gaza and so forth.
Maya, for the sake of time, is there a question specifically to this issue?
I'm just wondering if the United States would ever have thought of this thing as an idea on solving the problems of the Middle East, and that could be done.
No, I don't think it would have any serious. He's considered an extremist, even among Israelis, and I don't think there's any prospect that a U.S. administration would adopt that plan. I could not imagine it. I mean, I don't think an Israeli government, there's no Israeli government, I would imagine, that would adopt that plan. There are many different schemes or plans that have been proposed. And I certainly, you know, the 2-state solution, there are many different versions of a 2-state solution. And that's certainly not a perfect solution by any stretch of the imagination. But that his specific scheme, and partly is not one that most Israelis would endorse or get behind, let alone one that an American government or Palestinians would support.
Great. Okay, so in a bit of a different vein, going back stateside, do you think that Jewish organizations, J Street, AIPAC, ADL, the federations, are helping to shape young Jewish views of Israel, or do you think that the young Jewish generation is more shaped by social media and groups that are more in line with their views?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I want to say both. I think the views of young Jews, I mean, obviously it differs depending upon where they are and where they live and their levels of education. So if we're talking, and their levels of religiosity. So let me kind of qualify that a bit and say, let's talk about non-Orthodox, because I think the views of young Orthodox Jews are shaped primarily from Hebrew schools, from day school, and from spending a year in a religious seminary or a yeshiva in Israel. And so their kind of socialization process with regards to Israel of young Orthodox, and particularly young ultra-Orthodox Jews, is very different than non-Orthodox American Jews. So speaking specifically of young non-Orthodox American Jews, I think in many ways, as I said, there's a couple of factors. First of all, I've noted the role of the media in shaping their perceptions, in particular, because the media focuses largely on Israel's conflicts and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think the lens through which many young American Jews have come to perceive Israel, at least those who haven't had much first-hand experience with the country, is through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, and that's primarily through their consumption of media, and increasingly social media. as well. So that I think is a big influence. The other influence is obviously if they attend college, is their experience taking courses, whether it's Israel studies courses or other courses, or more broadly, just in dorm rooms, in the cafeteria, having conversations, what they hear. They don't have necessarily well-formed, detailed views about Israel, but they may have, they develop a general, often negative impression from those kinds of experiences. So I think, I would say, broadly speaking, whereas in the past, the views of young American Jews were primarily shaped within the American Jewish community, right? By going to, by going to Hebrew school, right? Going to summer camps, through their parents, through their synagogues. Those kind of socialization, those methods of socializing young American Jews and which young American Jews developed very strong and positive feelings for Israel, now they're less effective, and increasingly it is kind of the wider media, social media, college campuses that shape their views. And this is one reason why I think one of the most common things you hear, I hear it from so many Jewish students, is this kind of shock they experience when they go to college, and they suddenly feel that everything they were told in Hebrew school, in Sunday school, is just, mythic or false or a lie even. And then they experience this kind of, feeling of alienation in many cases from the organized American Jewish community, because there is this, still within large parts of the organized American Jewish community, although it's shifting, this idealized view of Israel. Like, you cannot teach about the real Israel. You cannot cover both the good and the bad, the flaws and the triumphs. Instead, you have to give this very, rosy, very rosy mythical view of the land of milk and honey, or the land of Exodus. And that then creates what I would call as a kind of cognitive dissonance that young American Jews experience when they then are on social media or hanging out with their friends. Let's not forget, one of the key changes today is that young American Jews of this young generation today, most of their peers, most of their friends are not Jewish. They're not, in years past, generations past, people grew up in communities surrounded by other Jews, where went to schools where there are many other Jews. That's very different today. And most young American Jews today also come from interfaith backgrounds. So they're very different experiences that shape their outlook regarding Israel. And I think explain why within the American Jewish community, there is a generational divide when it comes to Israel, as there is a generational divide within among Americans more broadly.
Sounds like a very familiar conversation. Wonderful. Okay, so I think we have time for about 2 more questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, so this one is, we have seen the Muslim community in America becoming increasingly prominent politically. What trends do you see in terms of this involvement, and how do you think that's going to impact domestic support for Israel?
So, yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Muslim Americans and their politics, but I have advised somebody, I was a PhD advisor, somebody who did write their book on this very subject. So I've learned quite a bit about this. And one of the things that I learned was that the Muslim American community is extremely heterogeneous. We tend to think that, Muslim Americans, therefore they're going to be pro-Palestinian, right? That's not as simple as that. Most Muslim Americans, for one thing, are not Arabs. They don't hail from the Middle East, more likely to come from South Asia. So it's very hard to kind of generalize about Muslim American politics, precisely because Arab Americans, yes, we can talk about as Arab Americans become more influential and more politically active, but Muslim Americans is a much wider group who don't necessarily all have, share common views about the Palestinian issue or the importance that should have in Muslim American politics. I think for most Muslim Americans, their own rights and civil liberties and integration in the United States is the #1 issue, as it was, by the way, for Jewish Americans for many years. In many ways, what we see with Muslim Americans is, in a sense, exactly the same process of acculturation and integration and political mobilization that occurred generations ago among Jewish Americans. This is now not the generation of immigrants, but now second or third generation of Muslim Americans who are finding their voice politically, but in many ways it's not on foreign policy issues. That said, within the Democratic Party, there is an a growing constituency, particularly within the Democratic Party. And again, I think that's why the domestic politics of Israel in the United States is changing in ways that won't, I don't think, simply undermine support for Israel, but will make support for Israel less obvious and less consensual, and make it one that you have to make more of the case for, and there'll be much more argument about.
Great. All right. So last but certainly not least, we've talked a little bit about how U.S. support for Israel might be declining or might just be, a little bit teetering. Do you think that Israel will look elsewhere in the world? We've kind of seen this power vacuum in a sense in the Middle East in the past few years, kind of replaced by Russia, but also maybe not. How do you see that unfolding? And when do you expect President Biden to visit the Middle East? Do you think it'll be a priority?
So yeah, it's an interesting question. If the United States, if US support for Israel does diminish in the decades ahead or in the years ahead, I think there's certainly a conversation happening among Israeli strategic thinkers, strategists within the security establishment, beginning to think about, a post-American Middle East. Like how can Israel, what should Israel do, and how should it manage its relations, not just in the Middle East, but beyond, as American dominance in the world and American influence in the world is declining. And you have I've heard some Israelis say, well, we have a good relationship with Russia, which Israel does have, and we have a growing relationship with China, so we're going to be okay. I would beg to differ. I think, there's no way that China or Russia or any other potential great power could be a substitute for the United States, in the way that the United States has given it such exceptional level of support to Israel. Israel has in the past lost its great power patron. We shouldn't forget that initially Britain in the pre-state era was the great power supporter initially at one point of the Zionist movement. Think about the Balfour Declaration. Then the British kind of abandoned the Zionist movement. Then the French became Israel's great power patron in the 1950s and early 1960s. Then the French abandoned Israel, and then the United States took over from the 1960s. So in historical terms, this isn't a completely unusual process, but I just don't see any potential great power that could provide anything close to the kind of support that the United States has provided Israel. And that's why I think this is a real challenge for Israel. But certainly Israel has many other relationships. It's not going to find another country willing to provide the same level of support that the United States has provided. But I also think Israel is not the kind of weak, vulnerable, fledgling country that it was in decades ago, and it can stand on its own feet. And so even without the kind of level of American support that it receives today, it's not an existential threat for Israel. Israel can survive and flourish and survive in the future if that happens. I think that if he goes to Israel, if he goes to the Middle East, one thing he will certainly do, which Obama didn't do when he first visited the Middle East, is Biden will go to Israel. No question. That was a big mistake that President Obama did by going to Egypt and skipping over Israel. Biden's not going to make that mistake. But I don't think he's going to rush to the Middle East anytime soon. I mean, the focus is here at home for obvious reasons. And so I think the desire of the Biden administration will be to try to shift attention and resources away from the Middle East. Whether they're going to be able to do that depends on what happens in the Middle East, and only time will tell on that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. What awesome questions from everybody too. Thank you for everyone who sent some in. With that, I think I'm going to redirect it back to Greg to close for the evening. But really, what a wonderful evening. So thankful for all of you who joined tonight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you all. And yeah, hopefully I'll have the chance to do it in person at some point.
Dr. Waxman, I want to thank you so much on behalf of everyone here tonight. It was brilliant. Victoria sang your praises when she told me she was able to get you to come on, and you are amazing, and I want to thank you very much on behalf of all of us. I want to remind everyone here, you're going to get a couple emails from us. That's it. We're not going to inundate you, but we're going to send you information on signing up to be a delegate to the state convention. Very important for all of us as Democrats to have a say in who are elected delegates to the state convention. And then we're going to also send you a little promotional email inviting you to our Hanukkah party. Dr. Waxman, you're invited as well. It's a fun virtual event. Victoria will send you the information on it. It's better than that. It's free for members of DFI, and the least we can do is make you a member of DFI, since we don't have a great honorarium to give you, sir. Thank you all very much for being here tonight, and hope you have a good week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Stay healthy.